"You remind me of the man I prayed for." That was what she said to me, standing in the long afternoon light with a hand still resting on the top rail of the fence I had just finished mending. And for a long moment I could not answer her, because a sentence like that does not travel through the ordinary channels of ordinary conversation. It lands somewhere older. It lands somewhere a man does not always know he has been keeping open. Silas Ward was 34 years old that September, unmarried, and living 6 miles east of Durango on a modest quarter section of grazing land that had once belonged to his father. He had brown hair kept short under a sweat-darkened felt hat, gray eyes that carried the quiet of a man who had done more listening than talking in his life, and a jaw that had learned early to hold its own counsel. He stood a shade over 6 feet, lean the way men are lean when their labor is honest, with a stiffness in his left shoulder from a fall off a green horse when he was 19. He wore a faded blue work shirt buttoned to the throat, canvas trousers, and boots that had been resoled twice. He was not handsome in the way traveling salesmen were handsome. He was handsome the way a well-kept tool is handsome. He was reliable. He was there. He ran 42 head of red and white shorthorn cattle on that quarter section, kept a bay gelding named Perch and a mule named Mildred, and he owed the bank in Durango $112 against next year's calf crop, which was about the ordinary weight of hope a young rancher carried in the San Juan country in 1883. His neighbor, 3/4 of a mile up the wagon road along the creek, was Mrs. Ellen Rutherford, 61 years old that same September, a widow of 9 years, and one of the last of what the town of Durango called the founding wives, women who had come into the San Juan country when it was still more idea than settlement. She stood 5'4", with silver hair braided and pinned high in a coil at the back of her head, blue eyes gone slightly milky at the outer edges but sharp enough at the center, and hands that had grown thin without going weak. She wore, as she wore every day of her widowhood, a full-length gray wool dress with a high-buttoned collar and long sleeves cuffed at the wrist, a dark blue apron double-tied at the waist, and stout leather boots hidden almost entirely by her hem. She had a way of tilting her chin down and looking up over her spectacles that made grown men explain themselves twice. She kept 9 laying hens, 1 cross-old rooster she called Judge, a milk cow named Patience, and a kitchen garden that fed her through most of a Colorado winter with a little left over for the pasture. Her husband, Thomas Rutherford, had died in April of 1874 of a fever that took him inside of 11 days. They had buried him at the foot of the ridge that overlooked their east pasture, under a plain granite marker that Ellen washed clean 4 times a year with lye soap and a horsehair brush. They had not had children. That was the sentence Ellen used. When she used it at all, we were not given children. She never said it with bitterness. She said it the way a person reads out a line of scripture they have made peace with. The fence between Silas Ward's land and Ellen Rutherford's land ran for 1,400 yards along the north side of the creek. It had been raised in 1868 by Thomas Rutherford and Silas's father, Amos, in the same week, the 2 men working through a run of 16 consecutive days with hammer and post-hole spade and a wagon load of split-cedar rails hauled up from the mill at Pueblo. Thomas and Amos had been friends. Amos had been dead now for 7 years. Thomas for 9. The fence they had raised together was, in a plain sense, the last handshake left between them, and both properties still leaned on it. By that September of 1883, 30 of the fence's original cedar posts had rotted at the base, and 40 of its top rails had split or fallen. Silas had noticed it in July. He had noticed it again in August. He had ridden the whole line once in the second week of September with a small notebook and a stub of carpenter's pencil, and he had counted every failure, and he had ordered the replacement lumber from the Durango yard on a Wednesday. He did not tell Ellen Rutherford he was going to fix her half. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he began at dawn on the following Monday, and he worked in stretches of 4 hours before he stopped for water, and he did not ride up to her house to announce himself, because he had grown up understanding that certain kinds of help lose their shape the moment they are declared. His father had told him that once, standing in this same pasture, sinking a post with a maul, a man who tells you what he is doing for you is asking for something back. A man who just does it is not. So Silas Ward did it, and he did not ask. He worked the line from the west corner east, sinking new posts to a depth of 30 inches, tamping them with river gravel, and setting the rails with square nails driven at a slight downward angle so the weather would draw the wood tighter rather than loose. His hands blistered by the end of the first day and hardened by the end of the second. And by the third day the palms of his gloves were dark with sap and dust, and the sweat had made a broad pale ring across the back of his shirt. He was 3 days into the work and about 400 yards along, when Ellen Rutherford came down the wagon path with a covered basket over her arm and stopped 10 feet short of him and stood there without speaking for the length of time it took him to finish driving the nail he had started. He straightened. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mum." "Mr. Ward." The basket was linen-covered. It smelled of yeast and butter. She set it on the flat top of the nearest new post as if the post had been made for that purpose. She did not look at the fence. She looked at his hands. Then she looked at his face. Then she looked past him at the length of finished line running back toward the creek. And she was quiet the way a person is quiet in a church they have not been inside of for a while. "You've been out here since Monday," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You didn't come and tell me." "No, ma'am." She nodded once, slowly. "Not a Tuesday." She had come on a Thursday, which he noticed, because in 9 years of neighboring she had never once come to his side of the creek on a weekday that was not Tuesday. She brought bread on Tuesdays. That was the ritual. Bread on Tuesdays. Coming on a Thursday meant something had moved in her that could not wait until the schedule caught up. "There's biscuits," she said, "and a little of the peach preserves from last year. Don't let them sit out." "No, ma'am." "Thank you." She turned and walked back up the wagon path and did not look behind her. He watched the small square of her apron move away between the cottonwoods until she was gone. Then he ate one biscuit standing where he was, and he drank from his canteen, and he went back to work. The town of Durango at that point held a little under 900 souls, and it held opinions about most of them. It held, in particular, an old and settled opinion about Ellen Rutherford, which was that she was a good woman who had accepted her portion, and it held a newer, quieter opinion about Silas Ward, which was that he was a good man who had never asked for one. The two opinions had not, until that September, ever crossed in any public way. But small towns are made of small kitchens, and small kitchens are made of small windows, and small windows had seen the fence. The first to speak of it out loud was Dorothea Hensley, 68, the postmistress, who had run the Durango post office out of the front room of her own house for 22 years, and who considered all 6 miles of the Eastern Wagon Road her personal jurisdiction. She said to her sister-in-law Miriam, over tea on the following Saturday, that Silas Ward had been fixing Ellen Rutherford's fence for 4 consecutive days, and had not said one word about it to Ellen or to anyone else, and that if that was not the plainest thing a person could see, then she, Dorothea, would eat her own bonnet. Miriam Hensley, 62, who ran the town's small dry goods counter, agreed calmly that she had noticed, some months back, that Silas Ward's eyes went a particular way when Ellen Rutherford came into town on the first Saturday of every month for her flour and her lamp oil, and that Ellen Rutherford's chin came up in a particular way when she heard his boots on the boardwalk, and that anyone with 2 eyes and half a heart could see it, and had been able to see it, in truth, for the better part of a year. The third was Reverend Callum Pruitt, 59, who did not gossip on principle but who listened, and who added only that Ellen had asked him, in June, whether the Lord ever answered a prayer that a woman had stopped daring to pray. He did not repeat what Ellen had prayed for. He did not have to. Dorothea and Miriam both, being of the founding wife generation themselves, understood the shape of the thing already. And tell me, wherever you are watching this from tonight, in what country, in what kitchen, at what hour. Tell me whether you have ever known a small town like Durango, where the women at the post office knew a thing about your heart before you knew it yourself. I would like to hear it. The fourth was Jonas Bell, 47, a widower himself, who lived alone above his saddle shop on Main Street, and who had, in a shy and dignified way, been calling on Ellen Rutherford for the better part of 18 months. Sunday dinners, an occasional walk to the Methodist church, the loan of a book. Jonas Bell was a decent man. He was not a rival in the ordinary sense of that word. He was simply another lonely, honorable person who had, in the fullness of a widower's grief, allowed himself to hope for a companion, and had chosen Ellen with a slow and respectful care. He heard about the fence on that same Saturday in the barber shop, and he set down the coffee cup he had been holding and did not pick it up again. Ellen did not know any of that yet. She only knew that on Thursday she had walked down to the creek with a basket of biscuits she had baked at 4 in the morning without exactly knowing why she was baking them, and she had watched Silas Ward's hands set a fence rail with the calm, unshowy competence of a man who was not doing it for her to see, and she had thought a sentence she had not thought in 9 years, which was, Thomas would have liked him. She thought it again on Sunday at church, when he was 3 pews ahead of her and she saw the back of his sunburnt neck above the collar of his one clean shirt. She thought it again on Monday morning, standing at her kitchen window with her coffee cooling in her hands, watching him come back to work on the east half of the line, and she said aloud to the empty kitchen, Lord, I am too old for this, which is not a prayer of denial but a prayer of surrender. And any woman of her generation knew the difference. Silas Ward worked the fence for 11 days in all. On the 7th day he replaced the sagging gate at the crossing where the wagon path met the boundary, and he built the new gate with a small unnecessary refinement, a curved cap on the top rail that shed water 2 ways instead of 1, because his father had built the original that way, and because Amos Ward had told him once that a gate built for a widow ought to be a little kinder than a gate built for a stockman. On the 9th day he set a new corner post at the east end and, unasked, extended the line 6 additional feet to close a small gap where cattle had been slipping through into Ellen's kitchen garden. On the 11th day he cleaned his tools by the creek, loaded his wagon, and rode home. He did not stop by the house. Ellen Rutherford stood at her kitchen window and watched him go. The following Tuesday, a Tuesday this time the ritual restored, she came down the wagon path with a fresh loaf and a small tin of the peach preserves. He was in his own barn, patching a bridle. She stood in the doorway and did not step inside. You're finished, she said. Yes, ma'am. You did not send a bill. No, ma'am. Silas Ward. It was the first time in 9 years she had used his given name. He set the bridle down on the bench. He turned and faced her fully. He did not speak. You remind me, she said, of the man I prayed for. She said it plainly. She did not weep. Her chin was steady and her hands were folded over the top of her apron, and her eyes were on his eyes and did not move away, and the whole barn had gone as quiet as a barn goes at midday when even the horses are listening. He did not answer at once. He was a man who had learned to let a sentence land before he touched it. When he did speak, his voice was low and unhurried. Ma'am, he said, I don't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything to it. I want to. Then take your time. She set the loaf on the bench beside the bridle. She turned, and she walked out of his barn, and she walked back up the wagon path in the September light, and she did not look behind her. He stood there for a long time after she was gone. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. That was what Silas Ward was thinking as he stood in his barn with a loaf of Ellen Rutherford's bread on his workbench. He was thinking about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and about his father, who had died when he was 27, and about a girl from Pueblo he had almost married when he was 24 and had not, because she had wanted a house in a town and he had wanted a house on a piece of land, and neither of them had known how to give the other the smaller half of what they were. He was thinking about all the years since. He was thinking about the fence. He was thinking about the way Ellen Rutherford had said his given name. He did not go up the wagon path that afternoon. He waited a day. That was who he was. On Wednesday morning he shaved. He put on the clean shirt. He walked, rather than rode, the 3/4 of a mile up the wagon path, because a horse felt like an announcement and his boots felt like the truth. He stopped at the fence he had built, and he stood at the new gate a full minute with his hand on the curved top rail, and only then did he unlatch it and step through. Beneath his palm the wood was still faintly sticky with the last of the cedar sap, and it smelled of the mill at Pueblo, and of his own labor, and of a promise he had not yet said out loud. Ellen was at her kitchen window. She had seen him from the moment he cleared the cottonwoods. She met him at her own front step, in the same gray dress and the same dark blue apron, and her braid was freshly pinned, and her hands were folded, and she said, "Come in, Mr. Ward," and he took off his hat. They sat at her kitchen table. She poured coffee. He waited until she was seated before he lifted his cup. "Mrs. Rutherford." "Ellen. Ellen." He set the cup down. "I was not fixing that fence to be seen fixing it. I want you to know that first. I know that already, Silas. That is why I said what I said." He nodded once. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. "I have lived by myself a long time. I am not a talker. I do not have a great deal of practice with saying a thing like this out loud. I have lived by myself 9 years," she said. I do not need a great deal of practice from you. I need honesty. Then I will give you that. Go on. He drew a breath. I have thought about you, he said, for longer than is proper for a man not to speak of it. I did not speak of it because you had a marriage and a grief and a place in this town, and I did not want to add my weight to any of them uninvited. I fixed the fence because it needed fixing, and because my father built the first half of it with your husband, and because it is the plainest way I know to tell you that if you should ever want a neighbor to be more than a neighbor, you would not have to ask me twice. That is all I came to say. Ellen Rutherford put down her coffee cup. Her eyes were wet. She did not look away. Silas Ward, she said. I am 61 years old. I know your age, ma'am. I have buried a husband. I know it. I am not the woman I was at 30. I did not come courting the woman you were at 30. I came to the woman standing in her doorway on a Thursday with a basket of biscuits. There was a very long silence. The clock on the mantel ticked, and outside a jay called twice from the cottonwoods, and the September light came sideways through the window and fell in a warm long rectangle across the scrubbed pine of Ellen Rutherford's kitchen table. I prayed, she said, for a man who would fix a fence without being asked. I know it now. I stopped praying for it a long while ago. I know that too. You remind me, she said again, more quietly than the first time, of the man I prayed for. That was what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. That evening, back at his own place, Silas Ward sat on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched the sun set over the San Juan Range. He thought about Jonas Bell. He had known Jonas Bell his whole life. Jonas was a decent man and a lonely one, and Ellen Rutherford would need, before Sunday, to speak plainly to Jonas Bell, and Silas did not envy her that. He hoped only that Jonas would be given, in his turn, the same kindness he himself had been given. A woman who told him the truth without cruelty. That much he could not do for either of them. That much was theirs. Jonas Bell came out to Ellen's kitchen on Friday afternoon. He drove himself in his small trap and he came up the wagon path slowly, and he took off his hat before he was fully to her porch. Ellen met him on the step. She did not invite him inside. That was not unkindness. That was clarity. A kitchen was where you took a man you were keeping. A porch was where you took a man you were letting go. Jonas, she said. Ellen. He was 51 years old, thick-shouldered, with brown hair going gray at the temples and a broad, honest face. He looked at her, and he saw what she was about to say, and he set his jaw once, and he nodded slowly to himself before she had spoken a word. I have been calling on you, he said quietly, for a year and a half. You have, and you have been kind and steady, and I have thought highly of you every one of those months. But, he looked past her at the ridge above the east pasture, where Thomas's marker stood, and his eyes were very steady. He fixed your fence. Yes. Not for pay. No. Not with a word said about it. No. Jonas Bell drew a long breath. He put his hat back on his head slowly, and he settled it, and he was quiet for the space of 10 seconds. Then he did not turn to go. He held his ground on her porch, and he looked her in the face, and he spoke. Ellen Rutherford, he said, and his voice was not bitter but it was low. I want to say one thing to you and I want you to hear it, because I have earned the right to say it. I did everything a courting man is supposed to do. I came Sundays. I brought the books. I sat in your parlor. I asked after your health. I was patient. I did not press. I did what my mother taught me a man does, and I did it for 18 months, and I would have done it for 18 more. I know you would have. And it was not enough. Jonas, let me finish. She waited. It was not enough, he said, because the thing you were waiting for was not a man who did what a courting man does. It was a man who did what a husband does before he has been asked. I do not know if I could have learned that. I might have. I did not. I do not hold it against you that you saw the difference. I hold it against myself that I did not know there was one. And I will tell you a plain thing, standing here, so that later you do not soften it in your memory into something easier. It costs me to say it. Costs me a good deal. I had let myself picture a kitchen. I had let myself picture more than a kitchen. A man my age does not picture such things lightly. I am putting that picture down now on your step of my own hand because you deserve that and because I do." Ellen Rutherford's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. "Jonas Bell," she said, "you are a good man. I am. And I will be a good man to some other woman in some other year, and I will remember what you taught me on this step. I wish you every happiness, Ellen. Give him my regards." He touched the brim of his hat. He turned. He walked back to his trap. He did not look behind him. He drove down the wagon path in the low golden light, and the dust from his wheels hung in the September air a long time after he was out of sight. Ellen sat down on her porch step and cried, quietly, for the space of 4 minutes. For a good man she had not chosen, and for a good man she had. Then she stood up and she washed her face at the pump, and she went inside and started supper for 2. They were married in Durango on the 14th of November of that same year, in the small Methodist church with the west windows, by Reverend Callum Pruitt, in front of 31 people. Ellen wore her gray dress and her dark blue apron. She had refused, gently but firmly, all suggestions of a new one. "This is who I am," she had said. "I will not be married in a costume." Silas wore the clean shirt, and boots that had been resoled a 3rd time for the occasion, and his father's plain silver ring, which he had carried in a pocket for 7 years without knowing why. Dorothea Hensley wept openly in the 2nd row. Miriam Hensley did not, but she gripped her sister-in-law's hand so tightly that the marks were still on Dorothea's wrist an hour later. Jonas Bell was there. He sat in the back. He shook Silas Ward's hand at the door on the way out, and he said only, "Take care of her," and Silas Ward said, "I will," and that was the whole of it. The good, brave dignity of that handshake was the thing Silas remembered longest from his own wedding day, and he never told Ellen about it, because some kindnesses belong only to the men who exchange them. They kept both houses through the winter, and in the spring Silas moved his things up the wagon path in 3 careful wagon loads and settled into Ellen's kitchen and Ellen's life. He did not remove Thomas Rutherford's picture from the mantel. He did not ask to. Ellen watched him look at it once on the first evening, and he had only said quietly, "He built a good house," and she had loved him a little more for that than she had known was possible at her age. He built her, that April, an east-facing window in the small side room that had been Thomas's study, because she had said once, in passing, that the morning light in that room had always been poor. He built it without saying he was going to build it. He built it while she was in town on the first Saturday of the month for her flour and her lamp oil. She came home and found it done, and she stood in the doorway of the little study with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the April sun was coming through the new glass in a warm broad shaft across the pine floor, and she did not say anything for a long moment, and then she said, "Silas Ward," and he came from the barn and stood beside her, and she put her hand on his arm, and neither of them spoke for a long time. On the sill of that window, that same afternoon, he placed without a word the small tin ferrotype of Thomas Rutherford that had lived 9 years on Ellen's mantel, so that the morning light would fall on it first. She saw it there in the evening when she went in to close the shutter, and she stood very still, and she understood, without any further sentence being spoken, that a good man does not compete with a dead one. A good man makes room for him. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. They were given 14 years together, which was not as many as either of them would have chosen, but which was more than either of them had thought to ask for. Ellen died in the spring of 1897, of a quiet illness, in the bed she had shared with 2 husbands and regretted neither. Silas sat with her the last night and held her hand, and did not speak much, because she had told him early in their marriage that a good silence was worth more to her than a poor sentence, and he had never forgotten it. Her last words to him were the same words she had spoken to him in his barn on that Tuesday in September of 1883. He answered her, this time without hesitation. He buried her beside Thomas Rutherford, at the foot of the ridge above the east pasture, under a matching granite marker that he washed clean 4 times a year with lye soap and a horsehair brush, for the 22 years that he outlived her. He was buried, in his turn, on her other side, in the autumn of 1919, at the age of 70, by neighbors who had grown up hearing the story of the fence. The fence still stands. Some of it has been replaced twice since. The curved cap on the top rail of the gate has been replaced 3 times, always in the same style, by whichever neighbor's boy is being taught, that summer, how a gate for a widow ought to be built. The east window Silas built for Ellen has been replaced once, by a great-nephew of Reverend Pruitt's, who put it in during the summer of 1948 and who kept the old sash in his shed the rest of his life because he could not bring himself to burn a thing that had been built for that reason. And that, at the end of it, is the whole of the story. A man fixed a fence. A woman said a sentence. Neither of them was young. Neither of them was showy. Neither of them had, by the ordinary count of the world, very much left to give. They gave it anyway. If you are watching this tonight, wherever you are, and you have wondered whether it is too late for the quiet, unshowy kind of love, the kind that arrives without announcement and asks for nothing and stays, I want you to hear what Ellen Rutherford heard on a Tuesday in September, and what she said aloud in a barn to a man who did not know yet that he was the answer to a prayer she had stopped daring to pray. It is not too late. It has never been too late. Somewhere, right now, someone is quietly doing the work of loving you, and has not yet told you and does not intend to tell you because that is not the shape their love takes. Watch their hands. Watch what they mend without being asked. That is where you will find them. And if it is you, tonight, who has been doing the mending in silence, for someone you love, keep at it. The east window you are building will be seen. In time. In the right light. Thank you for spending this hour with me tonight. Thank you for letting these two people and this fence and this small piece of Colorado ground live for a little while in your kitchen or your car or beside your bed. If the story moved you, I would count it a kindness if you told me, in the comments, the name of the person in your own life whose hands have quietly mended something for you. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep riding. If you like this story, stay with me. Next, I want to tell you about a young cattleman east of Silverton who rode 18 miles through an April snow to bring a doctor to a stranger's cabin, and about the widow inside that cabin who opened the door and said one sentence to him that he carried for the rest of his life. Her exact words and what he answered are next.